Grace Callahan walked through the soft-hued corridors of Willow Creek Hospice Center, her senses absorbed by the familiar sounds and smells that spoke of both endings and beginnings. The air carried a faint scent of lavender, meant to calm, to bring some form of peace to those in their final days. Grace knew every corner of the hospice by heart, every creak of the worn floorboards, every small comfort that was shared among the patients here. Today was like any other, or so it seemed. Her day began with her usual rounds, making sure her patients were comfortable, their needs met, and most importantly, that they felt heard. It was during her rounds that she noticed Harold Thompson sitting by the window, his gaze lost somewhere far beyond the trees swaying in the hospice garden. There was something different about him today, something in the way his hands shook a little more than usual, or how his shoulders seemed to sag under an invisible burden. Grace was drawn to him, sensing a change that needed her attention. "Harold?" she said softly as she approached. The old man looked up, his sharp blue eyes filled with something she couldn't quite decipher: anxiety, regret, something beyond words. His expression softened when he saw her, the lines on his face easing slightly as he forced a sad smile. "Grace," he said, his voice a little hoarse, "I need to talk to you. There's something I need to get off my chest." Grace moved closer, sitting in the chair beside his bed. She knew these moments, these confessions of the heart, were not rare in a place like this. People often wanted to unburden themselves of their regrets, their secrets, and she had always been a willing listener. It was part of what she did. It was part of who she was. Harold took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for something heavy. His frail hands fidgeted, restless, until finally he spoke. "I had a child many years ago," he began, his gaze dropping to his lap. "A child I abandoned." The words hung in the air between them, their weight heavy and suffocating. Grace watched as his eyes welled with tears, the pain of his memories visibly pressing down on him. She waited, allowing the silence to stretch. Sometimes silence was the best gift she could give. "It was a mistake, a terrible mistake," Harold continued, his voice trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing at the time. But now, I wonder every day where the child is, what kind of person they grew up to be, if they ever hated me for what I did." Grace reached out, her hand resting on his arm, steady and gentle. "Do you want to tell me more, Harold?" she asked. She could see that he did, that the words were struggling to come out. But perhaps he wasn't ready yet. It was her job to be here, to help him find that strength in his own time. Harold nodded, a small, defeated movement. "Maybe later," he whispered. "But I want to find them. I want to make things right before it's too late." Grace nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. "We will do what we can, Harold. I'm here, and you don't have to do this alone." After finishing her shift, Grace walked back to her small apartment. The day's conversation with Harold lingered in her mind, tugging at her thoughts. His words had stirred something deep within her, a sense of longing, of something unresolved. She looked at the old photographs that decorated her walls, photos of her parents, lost to an accident when she was too young to remember them, and of her grandmother, who had raised her until she too passed away. Her past was filled with voids, unanswered questions that she had tried her best to ignore. Sitting on her worn-out couch, Grace allowed herself to feel the weight of Harold's confession, and how it reflected her own questions about family and belonging. She felt her heart swell with the need to do something to help him, not just as a nurse, but as a fellow person seeking some form of peace. The next day, Grace brought Harold his favorite tea, chamomile with just a touch of honey. She hoped it would help comfort him, maybe even coax him into opening up a little more. Harold looked at her with appreciation, his eyes glistening as he accepted the warm cup. There was something in the way he looked at her, a vulnerability that wasn't there before. He was ready now.
Grace, thank you, Harold said, his voice shaky.
I want to tell you everything. I don't have much time left, and this burden, it feels heavier by the day.
Grace nodded, her heart pounding softly in her chest. Take your time, Harold.
I'm listening. Slowly, Harold began to speak, his words filled with a deep sorrow that pierced through the quietness of the room. He spoke of his younger years, of how he had been a different man back then, more reckless, more interested in his own freedom than in the family he had left behind. He talked about the mother of his child, a woman he had loved deeply, but had hurt even deeper when he walked away.
The regret was clear in his voice, his eyes glassy as he recounted the choices he made, choices that led to a lifetime of wondering what could have been.
I tried to find them once, a long time ago, Harold confessed. But it was too late.
They had moved, and I had no way of tracing them.
I've thought about that child every day since. Grace listened, her heart aching for the old man before her.
She could see how much this weighed on him, how much he needed to find some kind of resolution, some peace. And in that moment, Grace made a decision.
She couldn't ignore the pull she felt she had to help him.
Not just because it was her duty as his caregiver, but because it was something she needed to do for herself too.
That evening, as she sat in her cluttered apartment, Grace picked up her phone and began making calls.
She wasn't sure where to start, but she knew she had to try.
She called a few contacts she had made over the years, social workers, friends in local community centers, hoping someone might know how to trace people, how to begin a search like this. As the days went on, Grace found herself becoming more and more involved in Harold's story.
She would visit him every day, collecting bits and pieces of information, names, places, small details that might lead somewhere.
Harold mentioned the last city he knew his child had lived in, and the name of the mother, a woman named Margaret. He talked about a locket, a small silver piece that he had kept, a relic of the family he had lost. He gave it to Grace, his hands trembling as he passed it to her.
This was theirs, he said, his voice breaking. If you find them, give this to them. Tell them I'm sorry. Grace held the locket in her hand, its weight feeling heavier than it should.
She looked at Harold, her heart aching with the responsibility she now carried. She knew the risks of getting so involved with a patient her colleague Diane had warned her more than once. But this was different. She couldn't walk away from this, not now.
She left the hospice that day feeling a sense of determination she hadn't felt in a long time. She was going to find Harold's child, no matter what it took.
As she walked through the darkening streets back to her apartment, she looked at the piece of paper in her hand, the name and city scribbled hastily across it.
This was the beginning of something significant. She could feel it.
And deep down, Grace knew that this journey was not just for Harold.
It was for herself, to a way to fill the voids in her own heart, to answer the questions she had always been too afraid to ask. Harold's confession had started something within her, something she couldn't quite name, but that felt like hope.
And she was going to follow it, wherever it led.
Grace's decision to help Harold had taken a firm root in her heart, and there was no turning back now.
Early that morning, she set off to trace Harold's past, her car making its way out of town towards the neighborhood Harold had mentioned the last place he had known his child to be.
The roads became narrower, the buildings grew older, and the air seemed to carry the weight of stories untold.
She parked her car on a small, cracked pavement and stepped out, her eyes scanning the area.
This was the place Harold had described: small houses that bore the signs of time, gardens with wild, overgrown grass, and the occasional bark of a distant dog.
She approached one of the older houses, a quaint structure with faded paint and a garden that had grown wild. She knocked on the door, waiting, feeling her heart pound in her chest.
Finally, the door opened, and an elderly woman with kind eyes and a frail frame peered out. "Can I help you, dear?" the woman asked, her voice gentle, as if softened by years of life's harshness. Grace smiled politely, trying to gather her thoughts.
"I am looking for some information about a family that used to live around here," she said.
"I am trying to help someone reconnect with his past."
"Perhaps you knew Harold Thompson."
The woman's face softened, and her eyes seemed to brighten a little with recognition. "Harold?"
"Oh, yes, I remember him," she said. "He lived a few houses down with his wife and little one."
"I remember when they left. Such a sad story." Grace nodded, encouraged by the response. "Do you remember anything about where they might have gone?" The woman thought for a moment before shaking her head slowly.
"I don't know exactly, dear. But I remember his wife, Margaret, once sent me a letter after they moved. They went to a different city. It was a long time ago, but maybe." She paused, shuffling inside her house, before coming back with an old, faded envelope.
"Here," she said, handing it to Grace. "This is all I have."
"It might be of some help."
Grace took the envelope, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. It wasn't much, but it was something.
She thanked the woman and left, her mind already turning over the possibilities of what she could find.
The next step was to track down anyone who might have known Margaret after she moved.
It was a small thread, but it was one she intended to pull until it led her somewhere.
Her next stop was a neighboring town where Harold's wife Margaret had supposedly relocated.
Armed with the information from the letter, Grace made her way through the streets, asking around and following every lead she could find. Eventually, she managed to track down a woman named Clara, a friend of Margaret's from those years ago. Clara lived in a modest apartment, and Grace felt a sense of anticipation as she knocked on the door. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 60s, her eyes sharp but warm, her face lined with years of experiences.
Grace explained why she was there, her words careful and respectful, and watched as Clara's expression shifted first to surprise, then to something softer, almost nostalgic. "Margaret, yes, I knew her well," Clara said, inviting Grace inside. They sat in the small living room, and Clara began to talk about her old friend.
She spoke of Margaret's strength, her love for her child, and the struggles she had faced after Harold had left.
The more Grace listened, the more she understood the depth of the pain that Harold's actions had caused, and the resilience that Margaret had shown.
"Do you know where they went after that?" Grace asked, hopeful.
Clara nodded. "They moved to a city not far from here," she said.
Margaret wanted a fresh start. She worked hard, did everything she could for her child. I think she wanted to leave the past behind.
She paused, looking at Grace thoughtfully.
I know Margaret would have wanted her child to have answers, if it ever came to that. I'm glad you're trying to help.
Clara gave Grace the name of the city and some details about Margaret's life. They're enough for Grace to have a starting point. Grace thanked Clara, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She returned to the hospice that evening, eager to share the news with Harold. As she entered his room, she saw him sitting by the window again, his eyes lost in thought. When he looked up and saw her, a spark of hope seemed to light in his eyes. "I found something," Grace said, sitting beside him. "I spoke with an old friend of Margaret's. She told me about the city they moved to, and she gave me a few more details that might help." Harold's eyes welled with tears, and he reached out to take Grace's hand.
"Thank you, Grace," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion.
"I can't tell you how much this means to me."
Grace squeezed his hand gently. "We're not there yet, Harold,
"But we're getting closer."
Harold nodded, and for the first time since she had met him, Grace saw a small glimmer of hope in his eyes, a hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he might find some peace before his time ran out.
He spoke more openly then, sharing small, tender memories of his child.
He mentioned the name Lily, the name of the little girl he had left behind.
Grace could see the pain and love intermingled in his words, and she knew that this wasn't just about finding someone.
It was about reconnecting the shattered pieces of a family, about trying to make something whole again, even if only for a moment.
The next morning, Grace decided to take a few days off from her duties at the hospice. She needed to follow this lead to the city where Margaret and her daughter had moved. Her colleague Diane, who had become increasingly concerned with Grace's involvement, confronted her in the break room before she left.
"Grace, are you sure about this?" Diane asked, her brow furrowed with worry.
"You're getting very personally involved. I don't want you to get hurt."
Grace took a deep breath, understanding Diane's concern.
"I know, Diane. But this feels different."
"Harold doesn't have much time left, and if I can help him find some peace, then I have to try." Diane sighed, her expression softening. "Just be careful, okay?" Grace nodded, giving her friend a reassuring smile before leaving.
She knew the risks, but her heart wouldn't let her do otherwise. With a sense of purpose, she packed her things and set off for the city that Clara had mentioned.
The journey was quiet, her mind filled with thoughts of what she might find, and of the impact it would have on Harold and perhaps even on herself.
As she drove, she looked at the locket Harold had given her, its silver surface glinting softly in the sunlight. It was a symbol of everything he had lost, and everything he still hoped to regain. It wasn't just about the child. It was about redemption, about finding a way back to the person he wished he could have been. The city was bustling when Grace arrived, its streets crowded with people going about their lives, unaware of the small but significant journey Grace was on. She felt a sense of determination as she stepped out of her car, ready to begin her search.
She started by visiting public records offices, hoping to find anything that could lead her to Margaret or Lily. It was slow work, and the city felt overwhelming in its size and noise.
But Grace was patient, combing through documents, making calls, and following every small lead she could find.
It was on her second day there that she finally found something, a record of a bookstore owned by a woman named Lily Patterson. Grace's heart skipped a beat at the name. Could it be?
She made her way to the address listed, her pulse quickening as she approached a small, quaint bookstore tucked between two larger buildings.
The sign above the door read Lily's Books, and Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. She stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly as she entered. The bookstore was cozy, filled with shelves of books that gave off a comforting, familiar scent of paper and ink.
Behind the counter stood a young woman with dark brown hair cut into a short bob, her bright green eyes curious as she looked up at Grace.
"Hi, can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice warm and inviting. Grace felt her throat tighten,
her eyes taking in the woman who might very well be Harold's daughter. She forced herself to smile, her mind racing with what to say. "Yes," Grace said, her voice soft. "I'm just looking around for now." She couldn't bring herself to say more, not yet. Instead, she browsed the shelves, her heart pounding, her mind trying to make sense of the emotions swirling within her. This was it. She had found her. But what came next? How could she reveal the truth without turning Lily's world upside down? Grace knew she had to be careful. She needed to be sure, to learn more, to gain Lily's trust before revealing something that could change everything. For now, she would wait. She would come back again and again until the moment was right. As she left the bookstore, Grace looked back at Lily, who had already turned her attention to another customer, her smile bright and genuine. Grace felt a surge of hope. She would bring Harold and Lily together. She would find a way. And in doing so, maybe, just maybe, she would find something for herself too, a sense of closure, a sense of belonging that had always eluded her. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Grace felt like she was on the right path. Grace's first few days in the city were a whirlwind of hope, doubt, and determination. She had come armed with a few names and memories, but finding tangible proof, something that would connect Harold's daughter to the present, felt like trying to hold onto mist. The city, alive with the sounds of cars, people, and the occasional distant siren, felt almost indifferent to her mission. Grace felt small but resolute. She had to find Lily. Her first stop was the Public Records Office, a large, imposing building with high ceilings and rows upon rows of neatly organized files. Grace spent hours here, leafing through old records, cross-referencing names, dates, anything that might help her find a trace of Margaret or Lily. The monotonous clicking of computer keys and the distant hum of conversation became a kind of white noise as she worked, her eyes tired but focused. There was a point when Grace almost thought of giving up, the stacks of irrelevant documents weighing her down. But then she found a record with Margaret's name listed in the city database, marking her as a previous tenant of a small apartment a few miles from where Grace was staying. The next day, she made her way to the address, hoping to find anything that would lead her closer to Lily. The building was a modest, aging structure, with chip paint and flower pots lining some of the windows. Grace stood in front of the building, taking in a deep breath before approaching the door. She knocked, and after a few moments, a young man answered, his expression curious. "Can I help you?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Hi, I'm looking for some information about a previous tenant, Margaret Patterson," Grace explained, her voice polite, hopeful. The young man frowned, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, I just moved here recently. I don't know much about the past tenants. You might want to ask the building manager. He lives on the ground floor." Grace thanked him and made her way down the narrow hallway, her shoes echoing softly against the old tiles. She found the manager's door and knocked, waiting as the door slowly opened to reveal an elderly man, his hair white and thinning, his glasses perched low on his nose. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice raspy. Grace gave him her kindest smile. "I am looking for some information about someone who used to live here, a woman named Margaret Patterson. I was wondering if you might remember anything." The old man looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Margaret? Yes, I remember her. She lived here with her daughter, Lily. Nice people. Moved out some years ago." Grace felt her heart skip a beat at the name. "Do you happen to know where they moved to?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid of the answer.
The old man scratched his head, thinking,
I think they moved across town. I remember Margaret talking about a job she got, something to do with books. She loved reading, that one, always had her nose in a book.
Grace nodded, feeling a rush of hope.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
She left the building, her heart pounding.
She had a lead books.
It wasn't much, but it was something.
That afternoon, Grace began visiting bookstores around the city, asking if anyone knew Margaret or her daughter.
She walked from shop to shop, the scent of old paper and ink filling her senses, the quiet rustle of pages a soothing background to her search.
Most people didn't know anything, but then, in a small, cozy shop tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, Grace found what she was looking for.
The shop was called Lily's Books, a simple sign hanging above the door. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she pushed the door open, the bell above it chiming softly. The store was warm, filled with mismatched shelves, each one overflowing with books of all kinds: novels, biographies, old classics, and new bestsellers.
And behind the counter stood a young woman, her dark hair cut into a short bob, her green eyes bright with curiosity as she looked up at Grace. Hi, can I help you?
The woman asked, her smile friendly, her voice soft. Grace felt her heart swell. This was her, this was Lily. She could see it now, the resemblance to Harold in her eyes, in the way she smiled, a kindness that was so familiar. Grace swallowed, trying to find her voice.
Yes, I'm just browsing for now, she said, her voice barely steady. Lily nodded, her attention turning back to the book she had been reading.
Grace wandered the store, her eyes scanning the shelves, but her mind was focused on the young woman behind the counter. How was she going to tell her? How could she reveal a truth that would change everything? Grace knew she needed to be sure, to take her time, to gain Lily's trust before dropping such a bombshell on her. Over the next few days, Grace found herself returning to the bookstore.
Each time, she would buy a small book, a collection of poems, a novel she had always wanted to read, anything to have a reason to talk to Lily. Slowly, they began to talk more about books, about the city, about life.
Grace learned that Lily had grown up here, that she loved writing, that she often felt like there was something missing in her life, but could never quite put her finger on what it was. Grace listened, her heart aching for this young woman who didn't know how close she was to finding the answers she had always been looking for. And in Lily, Grace began to see pieces of herself, pieces of her own longing, her own search for family, for belonging. It made her even more determined to help, to bring Harold and Lily together, no matter how complicated it might be.
One afternoon, as they were talking, Lily mentioned something that made Grace's heart skip a beat.
I've always felt like there's more to my story, she said, her eyes distant, her voice soft.
I was adopted, and my MOM never really talked about my biological parents. I used to wonder about them a lot when I was younger, but I guess I just
gave up.
It was too painful, not knowing.
Grace looked at her, her heart breaking for the young woman sitting before her.
She wanted to tell her right then, to show her the locket, to tell her about Harold, about the man who had never stopped regretting the decision he made so many years ago. But she held back, knowing that the time wasn't right. Lily needed to be ready, and so did Harold.
This was a fragile moment, and she couldn't afford to rush it. That evening, as she left the bookstore, her phone rang. It was the hospice.
Grace answered, her heart pounding as she listened to the nurse on the other end.
Harold's condition was worsening. He was asking for her, his voice weak, his eyes filled with a desperation that broke Grace's heart.
She knew what she had to do.
It was time.
She needed to tell Lily the truth, no matter how difficult it would be.
She couldn't let Harold leave this world without giving him the chance to see his daughter again, to make amends, to find some peace. The next day, Grace returned to the bookstore, her heart heavy but determined.
She approached Lily, her eyes meeting the young woman's, and she could see the question there, the curiosity, the trust that had begun to grow between them. "Lily, I need to talk to you," Grace said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing.
"It's important. Can we go somewhere private?"
Lily looked at her eyes widening slightly, but she nodded, sensing the seriousness in Grace's tone.
She led Grace to the back of the store, to a small room filled with old worn chairs and stacks of books.
They sat down, and for a moment there was silence, the air thick with tension.
Grace took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she reached into her bag, pulling out the locket. She held it out to Lily, her eyes meeting hers. "This belonged to your mother," Grace said, her voice soft, filled with emotion. "And I think
you need to hear a story
about a man named Harold."
about your father."
Lily stared at the locket, her eyes widening, her face pale as she looked back at Grace. What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice shaky. Grace took a deep breath, her heart aching for the young woman before her. "I'm saying that I think I found your father, Lily."
"And he wants to see you. He's been searching for you for a long time, and he's running out of time." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and filled with meaning.
Grace watched as Lily's expression shifted confusion, shock, fear, and something else. Something deep and painful that Grace recognized all too well. It was the feeling of a life suddenly turned upside down, of everything you thought you knew being questioned. "I need you to come with me," Grace said, her voice gentle.
"He's at the hospice, and he needs you. I know this is a lot, but please, just come with me." Lily looked at the locket, her hands trembling as she took it from Grace, her eyes filling with tears. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper.
"Okay, I'll come." And with that, Grace knew that the next chapter of this journey had begun, a chapter filled with uncertainty, with pain, but also with hope. It was time to bring Harold and Lily together, to give them both the chance to heal, to find each other before it was too late. And maybe, just maybe, Grace would find something for herself along the way too. Grace and Lily left the bookstore in silence, their footsteps echoing in the quiet alley as they made their way to a nearby CAF.
Grace's heart was heavy, her emotions tangled as she tried to figure out the right words to say.
She could feel Lily's tension, her confusion, and feel all of it palpable as they found a small corner table away from the bustling crowd.
The CAF was warm, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air, but the atmosphere between them was thick with unspoken truths. Once they were seated, Grace took a deep breath, her hands resting on the table. She looked at Lily, whose eyes were fixed on the locket, her fingers tracing its edges as if trying to unlock its secrets. Grace's voice was gentle but firm as she began. "Lily, I know this is a lot to take in.
I understand if you're feeling overwhelmed.
But I promise you, I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe this was important, if I didn't think Harold truly needed to see you." Lily looked up, her eyes filled with tears that she struggled to hold back.
"Harold," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "You're saying he's my father?"
"That he's been looking for me all this time?" She shook her head, a mix of disbelief and hurt flashing across her face.
"Why now? Why didn't he come for me sooner?" Grace reached out, placing her hand gently over Lily's.
"He's made mistakes, Lily. He regrets them deeply. I've seen the pain in his eyes. The way he talks about you. He left because he thought it was the right thing to do back then. He's lived with that regret every day since. She paused, her own eyes welling with emotion. I know it doesn't make up for the last time, and I can't ask you to forgive him. But he's sick, Lily. He doesn't have much time left, and he just wants to see you, even if it's just once. Lily was silent for a long moment, her gaze dropping back to the locket. She turned it over in her hands, her expression a mix of anger, sadness, and something else, something Grace could only describe as longing. I used to dream about this, Lily finally said, her voice barely a whisper. When I was a kid, I used to wonder about my real parents. I'd imagine all these different stories, all these reasons why they weren't there. But then I stopped. It was too painful, you know. To keep wondering, to keep hoping. Grace nodded, her heart aching for the young woman before her. I understand, she said softly. I can't imagine how hard that must have been. But you deserve to know the truth, Lily. And Harold deserves a chance to tell you himself. Lily looked at her, her eyes searching Grace's, as if trying to find something to hold onto in the midst of the chaos she was feeling. What if I go, and it's too much? What if I can't handle it? She asked, her voice trembling. Grace gave her a gentle smile, her eyes filled with empathy. You don't have to do this alone, Lily. I'll be there with you, every step of the way. And if, at any point, it feels like too much, you can walk away. There's no pressure, no expectations. This is your choice. For a long time, Lily didn't say anything. She just stared at the locket, her mind racing with thoughts and emotions. Finally, she took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging slightly as if the weight she was carrying was just a little lighter. Okay, she said, her voice steady, though her eyes were filled with tears. I'll go. I want to see him. I need to know. Grace felt a rush of emotion, relief, hope, and a deep sense of gratitude. She reached out, squeezing Lily's hand. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You're doing an incredible thing, Lily, for both of you. They left the CF together, the afternoon sun casting long shadows as they walked back to Grace's car. The drive to the hospice was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts, the weight of what was to come settling over them. Grace stole glances at Lily, seeing the determination in her expression despite the fear that lingered beneath. She admired Lily's courage, how, despite everything, she was willing to face the unknown, to open herself up to something so raw and painful. As they arrived at the hospice, Grace parked the car and turned to Lily, her voice soft. Are you ready? She asked. Lily took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the building before them. She nodded, her hand closing around the locket. As ready as I'll ever be, she said. They entered the hospice, the familiar scent of lavender and antiseptic filling the air. Grace led Lily through the quiet corridors, her heart pounding in her chest. When they reached Harold's room, Grace paused, turning to Lily. I'll go in first, she said, just to let him know you're here. Lily nodded, her expression unreadable as she watched Grace disappear into the room. Grace took a deep breath, her eyes immediately finding Harold, who was sitting up in bed, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. He looked frail, his skin pale, his body tired. Grace's heart ached for him. Harold, she said softly, stepping closer to his bed. His eyes fluttered open, and when he saw her, a small smile tugged at his lips. Grace, he whispered, his voice weak. You're back. Grace nodded, her eyes welling with tears. I am, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And I brought someone with me, Harold. Someone very important. Harold's eyes widened slightly, his gaze searching Grace's face as if trying to understand what she meant. Who? He asked, his voice barely audible. Grace stepped aside, her heart pounding as she gestured for Lily to enter the room. Lily took a hesitant step forward, her eyes locked on Harold. For a moment, there was silence and almost unbearable stillness as father and daughter looked at each other for the first time in decades. Harold's eyes filled with tears, his breath catching in his throat as he reached out, his hand trembling. Lily? He whispered, his voice cracking. Is it really you? Lily took another step forward, her own eyes brimming with tears. She nodded, her voice shaky. It's me, she said. I'm here. Harold let out a choked sob, his tears spilling down his cheeks as he looked at his daughter, the weight of years of regret and longing visible in his eyes. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Lily. Lily approached the bed, her heart aching as she looked at the frail man before her, the man who was her father, the man who had left, but who had also never stopped thinking about her. She knelt beside him, her hand reaching out to take his. I know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I know you are. Grace watched from the corner of the room, her own tears falling freely as she witnessed the reunion father and daughter finally together, both of them broken, but somehow whole in this moment. It was raw, it was painful, but it was also beautiful. It was the beginning of something that, though imperfect, was real. Harold's hand tightened around Lily's, his eyes never leaving hers. I've wanted this for so long, he said, his voice trembling. I've dreamed of seeing you again, of telling you how much I love you, how much I regret everything. Lily nodded, her tears falling onto his hand. I've wanted to know you too, she said, her voice filled with emotion. I never stopped wondering. Grace could see the years of pain in their eyes, the longing, the love that had always been there, but had never had the chance to be expressed. And now, in this quiet room, they had the chance. They had each other, even if only for a short while. As the sun began to set outside, casting a warm glow into the room, Harold's eyes grew heavy, his body exhausted. But there was peace in his expression, a softness that hadn't been there before. He looked at Lily, his voice barely a whisper. Stay with me. Lily nodded, her hand still holding his. I'll stay, she promised. Grace stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. I'll give you both some time, she said, her voice soft. I'm just down the hall if you need me. Lily looked up at Grace, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Grace gave her a small smile, her heart full as she turned and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. She leaned against the wall, her eyes closing as she took a deep breath, letting the emotions of the day wash over her. She had done it. She had brought them together. And in doing so, she had found something for herself too, a sense of purpose, of connection, that she hadn't realized she needed. This journey had been about more than just helping Harold find his daughter. It had been about love, about forgiveness, about finding the courage to face the past and embrace whatever came next. And for Grace, that was enough. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Grace's small apartment, casting a soft glow across the walls. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts as she prepared for the journey ahead. Today was the day they would go to see Harold, the day that Lily would finally meet her father after a lifetime of wondering and imagining what he might be like. The weight of it all was heavy on Grace's mind, the gravity of the reunion pushing down on her chest. She wanted this moment to be right,
for both Harold and Lily to give them a sense of closure and healing they desperately needed. Grace picked Lily up from her apartment, finding her standing by the curb, her eyes distant and her shoulders stiff with anxiety. She offered her a small, reassuring smile as Lily got into the car. The ride to the hospice was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was filled with anticipation, the kind of silence that felt like holding your breath before a leap into the unknown. As they approached the hospice, Grace could feel Lily's gaze turn toward her, a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. She could tell that Lily was bracing herself, trying to be ready for whatever would come next. Grace reached over, giving her hand a gentle squeeze, her voice soft but firm. Whatever happens in there, just know that it's okay to feel whatever you need to feel.
You are not alone, Lily. Lily nodded, her eyes glassy as she blinked away tears she didn't want to shed just yet.
Thank you, Grace, she whispered, her voice barely audible.
I don't know what I'd do without you here. The hospice was quiet as they walked through its halls, the soft sounds of beeping monitors and distant voices blending into the background.
Grace led Lily to Harold's room, pausing just outside the door. She turned to Lily, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. Lily took a deep breath, nodding at Grace, her expression resolute, even if her eyes betrayed the vulnerability she felt. Grace knocked gently before pushing the door open, stepping inside.
Harold was lying in his bed, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and labored.
He looked frail, the weight of his years evident in every line of his face.
But as soon as he heard the door open, his eyes fluttered, and when they landed on Grace, a weak but genuine smile curved his lips.
Grace, he whispered, his voice cracking. His eyes then shifted to the figure behind her, widening as they locked onto Lily. It was as though the air was pulled from the room, everything else fading as Harold's gaze settled on his daughter. Tears welled in his eyes, his hand trembling slightly as he tried to raise it.
Lily stepped forward, her own eyes glistening, and took his hand in hers, her fingers wrapping around his, the connection immediate and electric. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as if they both needed to just see each other to feel the reality of the other's presence. Lily, Harold finally managed to say, his voice barely more than a whisper, the word filled with years of longing and regret. My girl, is it really you? Lily nodded, her tears now streaming freely, her voice trembling.
It's me, Dad, she said, the words feeling both foreign and right. She had never said them before, and yet here they were, slipping from her lips as though they'd been waiting all her life to be spoken. Harold let out a choked sob, his eyes closing as tears slipped down his weathered cheeks. I'm so sorry, he said, the words coming out broken, heavy with emotion. I should have never left.
I should have been there for you.
I've missed you every day.
Lily's heart ached at his words.
She had imagined this moment so many times, had wondered if she would feel angry or indifferent, or if she would even care at all.
But now, seeing the frail man before her, seeing the tears of genuine regret in his eyes, all she felt was a deep, aching sadness. She had missed so much, they both had, and she couldn't bring herself to let anger take up space where there could finally be understanding.
I understand, Dad, she said, her voice soft, her tears still falling.
You did what you thought you had to do. I wish things had been different, but I'm here now. She squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his, and I'm not going anywhere.
Harold let out a long, shaky breath, his lips trembling as he looked at her. Thank you, he whispered, his voice full of gratitude. You have no idea what this means to me.
Grace stood quietly by the door, her eyes filled with tears as she watched the scene unfold. She could feel the love and pain between them, the years of separation, and the hope for something better in whatever time they had left. She knew that this was just the beginning for Lily and Harold. There was still so much to say, so much to process. But for now, in this moment, they were together, and that was enough. Lily sat by her father's side, talking with him softly, her fingers never letting go of his hand. They spoke of small things, catching up on all the moments they had missed, both of them too emotional to dive deep into the harder conversations just yet. Harold told her about his life, about his regrets, and about how proud he had always been of her, even from afar. He spoke of his hopes for her, the love that had never left his heart despite the years apart. Lily listened, her heart breaking and mending all at once. She had spent so long wondering why she had been left behind, so long trying to fill a void that seemed impossible to fill. But now, sitting here with her father, hearing his voice, seeing his tears, she realized that the emptiness she had felt wasn't hers alone. It was a space that belonged to both of them, a space that was slowly being filled by the love they were finally able to share. As the day turned into evening, Harold grew tired, his eyes heavy as he struggled to stay awake. Lily noticed and leaned in, her voice soft. "You should rest, lad." "I'll be right here." Harold nodded, his eyes closing as he gave her a small, tired smile. "Don't go," he whispered. "I won't," Lily promised, her hand still holding his. She watched as he drifted off to sleep, his breathing steady, a sense of peace finally settling over him. Grace stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. "You did amazing," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "I think this was exactly what he needed." Lily looked up at Grace, her eyes filled with gratitude and tears. "Thank you, Grace, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." Grace shook her head, her heart full. "You're stronger than you know, Lily. And you're not alone. You never will be." They sat together in the quiet room, the weight of the day settling over them. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a gentle twilight glow through the window. It was a bittersweet moment, one filled with the pain of the past, but also with the hope for a future where, even if it was for just a short while, they could be together. Grace knew that this journey wasn't over. There would still be hard days ahead, days when the pain of what was lost would feel overwhelming. But she also knew that today had been a starter step toward healing for both Harold and Lily. And for herself as well. She had learned that love, in all its forms, required bravery. It required letting go of anger, of regret, and embracing the imperfect moments that made life beautiful. And as she watched Lily sitting beside her father, her hand still holding his, Grace felt a deep sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do. She had helped bring them back to each other. And in that, she had found her own sense of purpose, a reason to keep believing in the power of love and forgiveness, even when the world felt dark. With a final glance at Lily and Harold, Grace stood up, her heart filled with both sadness and hope. She quietly left the room, closing the door softly behind her, leaving father and daughter to share the moment they both deserved. It was the beginning of something new, a fragile, precious bond that had been lost, but was now found again. And that, Grace thought, was enough. Hospice now meaning a place or service that provides care for the terminally ill. Example: Grace Callahan walked through the soft-hued corridors of Willow Creek Hospice Center. Explanation: a facility that provides comfort and care to patients in the final phase of an incurable disease. Confession noun meaning an admission or acknowledgement of a wrongdoing or a secret.
Example, Harold Thompson said, "I need to talk to you. There's
something I need to get off my chest."
explanation, the act of admitting something, often a personal or sensitive truth.
Burden now meaning a heavy load, often used figuratively to describe emotional weight.
Example, his shoulders seem to sag under an invisible burden. Explanation refers to a mental or emotional load that weighs a person down, often related to guilt or responsibility.
Fidgeted verb meaning to move restlessly, often due to nervousness or impatience.
Example, his frail hands fidgeted, restless, until finally he spoke. Explanation, to make small movements, usually of the hands or feet, because of nervousness or boredom.
Sag verb meaning to sink, droop, or lose strength, especially due to weight or age.
Example, his shoulders seem to sag under an invisible burden. Explanation, to bend or droop downwards, often because of physical or emotional weight.
Reconcile verb meaning to restore a friendly relationship after a conflict or disagreement. Example, how could she reconcile the woman she had known with the one she was now confronting?
Explanation, to bring two opposing sides into agreement or to make peace between them. Imposing adjective meaning, grand and impressive in appearance or demeanor. Example, the hospice was an imposing building with its high ceilings and soft colors. Explanation, something that appears large or impressive and often creates a sense of awe.
Resonated verb meaning to produce a positive feeling, emotional response or connection.
Example, his confession resonated deeply with Grace, stirring emotions she had buried long ago. Explanation, when something affects you deeply, often because it touches on shared experiences or emotions.
Did you enjoy Harold and Grace's story? Was the English easy to understand?
Let me know in the comments if this kind of story helps you practice your English. And don't forget, watching more stories is a great way to improve your comprehension. Right here at the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another story. Give it a click and let's keep learning together.
Thank you so much for being here.